chapter 14. We just last time talked about how Paul and Barnabas had set apart, designated elders, appointed elders in the churches on their way back to Pisidian Antioch. Now, one quick thing more about that process is all the churches I have been in from my growing up years and through my ministry career have elected elders. Essentially, all of those places really were, they did this through secret ballot. You know, you didn't identify yourself, you just checked beside, or I think it was mainly all checking beside, who would be elected as an elder for the church. Don't see that as wrong, but that's not how Paul and Barnabas did it. My sense is they would have had to have depended on the leadership of the Holy Spirit and their own wisdom and observation of these men, and they appointed them as elders. Now, we live in a democratic republic. Most of our public officials are appointed by election. We have it in our DNA as Americans that's the way we do it. We elect people. And so, as a carryover, we elect the elders and deacons in our churches. I don't think that's wrong. There are some advantages to that, and there are some disadvantages to that. I want to quickly share what I think the disadvantage is. When you set the polity, the organization of the church in a representative government model, you create some dynamics, I'll just say that may or may not be favorable for the growth and health of the whole church. You see, some churches have organized themselves to be like the U.S. government. We've got this sense of the elders are the Senate, the deacons would be the House of Representatives, and in some churches, the senior pastor is the president, his executive pastor would be the vice president, and then his cabinet would be all of the other associates. And in some churches, that's a smooth system. But sometimes you have this battle between the president and the legislative body, right? Conflict of will. That in itself can be not healthy for the church unless the people involved are mature enough to think of and treat the tension in that creatively with respect for each other. This does happen. I'd like to say it happens often, but I can't, in my experience. That's one of the disadvantages of this organizing the church like American government. In its worst case, you have people campaigning for these roles. That certainly didn't happen in Acts chapter 14. And I think there are lots of reasons why that's not a healthy dynamic in a healthy church. One of the other aspects is that when you elect elders and deacons, you have it's as part of our thinking of a representative government. This is not evil, I'll say it again, but one of the difficulties is sometimes in churches, members kind of have this thing that, well, you're supposed to represent my desires, and so you work for me. Well, that's true in government, or can be and should be true, but let's be honest, it is not always. It often comes down to the dynamic of power. You know what? These elders they weren't appointed to be representative of the people. They were appointed as, in my terminology, older siblings whose primary job was to partner with God and His grace to address the needs of the rest of the family. Okay, that's more than I probably meant to say, but let's look at that verse. In this is in beginning verse 23. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. That prayer and fasting thing, that ought to be part of the process in churches today as we elect and designate leaders. And for some it is. But I'll be, in reflecting on my experience in the church, not so much. It was more, fill out the ballots, we'll count them, then we'll tell you what the outcome is. Prayer and fasting is pretty much never mentioned. Well, the truth is, prayer and fasting is not mentioned very much by most churches today. Is that a sin? I don't think so. I just think it's unfortunate because it leaves us to our own devices. When we by prayer and fasting, we're reaching out to God for His wisdom and His guidance and His leadership. Okay. They committed them to the Lord. I don't know that this was a formal ordination service. Might have been. We have one potential example of what this might have looked like when you go back to where Paul and Barnabas were commissioned by the church. They laid their hands on them and prayed and commissioned them into their ministry of establishing and encouraging churches. So maybe that's what happened, but I don't know. But they committed them to the Lord. Well, I could say a lot about that, because this kind of takes out the representative government form thing, right? Or could, because this is not like us saying, now you're accountable to us. Well, no. Who's the accountability with? With God. Paul and Barnabas and the churches committed them to God, in whom they had put their trust. I'm struggling to constantly put my trust in God. I find myself so often trusting my abilities and trusting my background and education and working diligently, and these are all important things, but they are of almost no, well, really and truly on an eternal level, in the spiritual sense, they're worth nothing, because what matters is trusting God. Hebrews 10:23. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Faith and trusting, they're synonymous. I can't please God without faith. And I see the strong implication of this being the primary thing is faith, is trust. And out of that, by God's grace, comes behaviors of obedience, attitudes of obedience, thoughts of obedience, and the feelings of fulfillment and closeness to God. But I don't do these things to get close to God. I do these things because of His acceptance, His love for me, His grace at work in me, which I accessed by faith. We're saved by grace through faith, according to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. All right, made a big deal of it because it is a big deal. And then, verse 24, after going through Pisidia, now remember, that's where Antioch, this northern Antioch, up in what is today northern Turkey, after going through Pisidia, they came into Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. Now, these places, these cities, through the centuries, millennia, have come and gone, and now most of these places still exist on the map, but not at all in the form that Paul and Barnabas found them in. And, by the way, we don't know really very much about what they did, other than that they preached the word in these cities. We don't know the outcomes. We don't know any of the backstory. Just that, and here's what I get from it. I get that this is a picture for us of the fulfillment of Jesus's Great Commission from my brain's not working today, Matthew 28:19. Go, and therefore is in there, and the therefore is because all power has been given unto him in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go to the whole world and teach, baptize, and teach. And then I'll be with you always, even at the end of the age. A possible translation of that is, as you go into all the world. Wherever Paul and Barnabas went, that's what they did. They preached. They preached the word, meaning what God had given them of His design. Well, okay. There's not enough time to go any more deeply into this. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.